The king is dead. Bibi's goose is cooked. He is officially no longer the Prime Minister of Israel. He is, by far, I believe, the longest-serving Prime Minister of Israel. In fact, I think there was only a small window in my entire lifetime in which Netanyahu was not the Prime Minister of Israel. So, I mean, this is a pretty remarkable thing. For someone of my age, I can imagine it's a very significant thing if you're someone in your early 20s in Israel, because you would have. I mean that's like growing up in in Zimbabwe when Mugabe was forced out. It's like, wow, you've never known anyone else to lead your government. That guy's always been in charge. You always turn on the TV and it's the same guy jabbering and yakking in front of the flag. But now they got a new guy who. As far as I'm concerned, as an observer from the outside, doesn't seem all that different than the old guy. No, that's not to say that, if you're someone living in Israel, you might see very significant differences between Bennett and Netanyahu. But those are parochial interests and things that might concern, just Israelis, which you would think that would be the most important. That would be what's important when you're selecting a prime minister. But as an outsider looking at, the way that Netanyahu acts in international politics and with the Palestinians and things and wars and all that, I don't see Bennett being all that different. Bennett, seems to be someone who is just as, if not more, hawkish on the settlements in the West Bank. Compared to Netanyahu, he's already talking about wanting to annex a lot of the West Bank. He doesn't want there to be ever any independent Palestinian state, which, frankly, I think the Palestinians are on that bandwagon too. You don't really hear Palestinians ever talk about a two-state solution. It only ever seems to be liberal Zionists that talk about a two-state solution because, there's not the Israelis have too many settlements already in the West Bank that kind of the Palestinians can't separate themselves from the Jews. I think the Palestinians at this point just want civil rights. And so I guess in a way, perhaps Bennett being more hawkish and pushing harder on the settlements might, in an accelerationist sense, be better for the Palestinians than Bibi's preservation of the status quo. But then again, Netanyahu, after the last election, I believe, said he was going to annex part of the West Bank. I think it was the Jericho Valley, did they call it? I might be getting the exact term wrong, but it was something around Jericho. He wanted to, or maybe it was everything except for some area around Jericho. But he was gonna try and bite off a big chunk of the West Bank, which, again, Israel Israel owns all the West Bank. They have for decades now, and there's not really much of a illusion left that they're ever going to release that and, give it to some future Palestinian state. It's just not going to happen. Now, as far as domestic stuff goes, from what I gather, I think that Bennett is more aligned with the secularists in Israel. At least that seems to be the general understanding, is that the more secular people tend to like Bennett. And again, the secularists are just as can be just as ardent of Zionists as your most religious conservatives in Israel. They just they think of themselves purely as like an ethnic or a racial group, whereas the religious guys say, hey, God said that this belongs to us, and so anyone who is here who's not a Jew is against the will of God, or something like that. Now, with all that said, Netanyahu, on his way out, gave a speech in the Knesset distinguishing Bennett from himself and trying to, make the case that Bennett is, in fact, not going to be nearly as strong as Netanyahu on a myriad of issues. So it'll be interesting to keep these in mind and look back in the future and see if Bennett really does seem to be just govern as sort of a carbon copy of Netanyahu and end up doing a lot of the same things, or if Netanyahu ends up being right and Bennett is far weaker. Because again, Bennett does not portray himself as some squishy liberal soft on crime kind of guy. He seems to be very, very much not a friend of the Palestinians, even though he has Arabs in his coalition, which is quite an interesting twist. I'm not sure what the Arabs are getting out of being in this coalition, other than getting rid of Netanyahu. But again, getting rid of Netanyahu in exchange for Bennett, based on the way that Bennett talks a lot, seems to be kind of jumping out of the pot and into the fire. But obviously those guys are over there. They know a lot more than I do. They're talking to him directly. So maybe Bennett is just putting up a front. But I find that hard to believe, because even people who are, left of center in Israel, left of the Israeli center, they're still not big fans of the Arabs and of, Palestinians and their interests. And heck, I forgot to point out, I talked about this the last time when the news first broke that they had forged a bit of a coalition deal, though it was not finalized until today. And I'm fulfilling my promise and talking about it, because it did end up happening. Netanyahu was not able to wiggle his way out of this one. This was one brush with death to where he could not escape. But this is, to my knowledge, the first governing coalition in Israel in which an Arab party was allowed to come in, or wanted to come in. Who knows? Maybe there were times in the past where a coalition wanted to bring the Arabs in and the Arabs didn't want to. Although, from what I understand, vast majority of all cases, it was the Israeli, Jewish parties who didn't want the Arabs in their coalition. And in some cases, even if they were able, if they thought, even if they knew, hey, we could get a majority, we could be the government if we brought the Arabs in and got them on our team, they would reject that and say, no, we're going to let the other guys win, the other side, whether it was the left or the right. They would say, you know what, rather than bring the Arabs into the government, we are going to just let the left or the right, whoever the opposite was, win and have their government. But that's no longer the case. And so I guess that's a big achievement for Netanyahu, is that he, as a result of him, being in there for so long and being so hard to get rid of, that the other parties in the country finally said, you know what, darn it, we're going to let the Arabs in. So back to Netanyahu's farewell address, I guess you could call it. There were a lot of interesting highlights. I believe it was originally broadcast in Hebrew, so I was reading someone who was live tweeting it. So I didn't watch the video because I'm fairly certain he would have been doing this in Hebrew. Who knows? Maybe it was in English and I can go on and watch the whole thing, and maybe I'll try and find that later. But there were a couple instances that stood out to me. One of them was Netanyahu got in a dig at the incoming finance minister, and apparently, I guess, who knows how he was taking this out of context. But he seemed to be referring to some statement that the finance minister made that he thought ultra-Orthodox Jews belonged in landfills, which to me sounds like what I was talking about earlier, the divide between sort of the religious right and the secular right in Israel, and how Netanyahu has really tried to embrace the religious right and all that, and this new coalition seems to be made up of secularists largely. But also, he made another statement, particularly about, he made two statements about the United States. And when Bibi says stuff about the U.S. that Republicans, that would break sort of that would not confirm the bias of Republican voters and American Zionists, that would kind of make them scratch their head, if I see that, I know that Netanyahu probably originally said that in Hebrew, because he doesn't talk this way in English, because he knows that Republicans are listening and that Christian Zionists are listening. And so he can't say these things about America. He only says them in Hebrew. And so he made a comment about how back in 1944, Roosevelt could have bombed Auschwitz, and he chose not to, thus condemning millions of our brothers to death. Now, I find that funny. One, because, I'm not a fan of Roosevelt. I didn't like him. I thought he was terrible. Bad guy. He wasn't Hitler, but he was a bad guy. Terrible American president, one of the worst we've ever had. Not as bad as Woodrow Wilson, but up there. His vendetta against the Japanese Empire gave us modern communist China. I'd much rather have Imperial Japan back and have them dominate the Pacific than have a communist China of any sort. Not that I think that communist China is about to dominate the Pacific anytime soon, but, you get my point. But what Netanyahu said is also correct from what I understand. I'm pretty sure that Roosevelt could have taken out Auschwitz bomb the tracks to Auschwitz is normally what people say. Who knows? This might be a translation error. Some of these bits that I was reading, they did sound a little bit choppy, which makes me think that, again, this was being translated from Hebrew. But this is never something that Netanyahu would bring up if he knew an American audience was listening, because he always liked to talk about how America and Israel are joined at the hip, and Americans in this country, as far as they think, Israel is, the 51st state. As far as a lot of Americans are concerned, defending Israel is the same as defending America. Which makes Netanyahu's next statement even more interesting to me, because he, I don't know if chronologically this came after, but the next thing that stood out to me, this was the biggest thing that came out of Netanyahu's speech, was that he condemned Naftali Bennett, his successor, who is now as of right now, currently the Prime Minister of Israel, as being a weakling who couldn't stand up to Joe Biden, I don't think he specifically said Joe Biden. I think he said the President of the United States. And he essentially said that Bennett is going to be a puppet of Washington and is going to take orders rather than give them. And Netanyahu was bragging about how I never sat down for any American president, took direction from them. I did whatever the hell I wanted, and I told them what to do. Which, frankly, I think is a relatively accurate portrayal of history. Netanyahu, in my lifetime, has kind of done whatever he wanted. He does not really go along with American interests. It has been, the U.S. more often than not marching to the beat of his drum, when they are in sync, although a lot of the times the U.S. and Israel are not in sync. Hell, we know that the whole Iraq War was predicated on helping Netanyahu. The original idea for it was masterminded by David Wurmser and Paul Wolfowitz. On behalf of Netanyahu, they came up with a clean break. That was the name of it. I had to think of it for a second. And then, they went on to work for Bush. But, they wrote the whole idea for the Iraq War was, concocted by Netanyahu's advisors to help Israel. And in cases where the American government has done things that Netanyahu doesn't like, he makes it pretty clear publicly. And, like with the Iran deal, he's very unhappy about it. He's still talking about it. That's what his big focus of was going out. Actually, that's why he brought up Roosevelt. He said, hey, Roosevelt could have saved our people, and he didn't. And so we can't just stand by and let the Americans, do whatever they want. Essentially saying that going back to the Iran deal was like not bombing the tracks to Auschwitz. That was the analogy that Netanyahu seemed to be making there. He was saying we can't, rely on the Americans to defend us. We have to stand up for ourselves and stop them from enabling, Hitler 2.0, also known as the Ayatollah. Which, again, I don't know if this is ever addressed in Israeli politics, but there have to be people old enough in Israel who remember when Israel was friends with post-revolutionary Iran back in the 80s. Seems a little strange to me that is never mentioned, and they just act like they were always enemies with the Ayatollah. They were friends with, like, the real scary Ayatollah Khomeini, or Khamenei. I always mix up which was the older and which is the younger. But they were still friends with Iran when this current Ayatollah took over for a couple of years, and then it was in the 90s that they decided to pivot and join the Saudis for some reason, because the Saudis are closer to them, and they said, no, we're buddies with you, the Saudis and Al-Qaeda. And here Netanyahu comes out, and he's still talking about how, Iran would have had a nuke by now, and he would have nuked us all if it wasn't for me. And so I got to keep up my fight to make sure that Iran doesn't get a nuke, because with you guys in charge, Iran's going to nuke us all. So it's kind of funny to see that Netanyahu does this at home, not just internationally, because I know he does this everywhere. In the other country, that's what we always hear. It's the same thing that the Likudniks in America said. Oh my gosh, if you don't do absolutely everything to support Israel and give them billions of dollars every year, they're going to get nuked by Iran. You can't criticize the Israelis bombing civilian targets in Gaza. They could get nuked by Iran. You can't bring up al-Nakba from 1948. Israel's going to get nuked by Iran. It's the response to everything. And so it's just kind of funny to see Netanyahu use this against his own country back home in the Knesset. So, yeah, it wasn't a very gracious exit, but I guess, it's what you would expect from Netanyahu. I don't think, unlike American politicians, I guess except for Trump. Trump is the closest thing, it's kind of ironic, Trump is the closest thing to an American Netanyahu in that sense, in that, Netanyahu is going to do everything he can to hold on to every ounce of power that he can, and he's a lot smarter than Trump in that respect. He knows a lot more about actually, obtaining and wielding power. Trump never really understood that, but he did have the attitude of wanting to hang on to it, by every little thread that he could, and bitterly letting go of it. And so I would have to imagine that, what Netanyahu said was probably pretty compelling to his supporters. And I believe that Likud still is the single largest party in the Knesset. This new guy Bennett only has like 5 or 6 seats. I think he barely got 5%, which, if Israel works like a lot of the other proportional representation countries, 5% is probably the minimum margin. So this is a guy who just barely got to be a member of the Knesset, who is now the next prime minister for 2 years, I believe. And Netanyahu used that to try and attack his legitimacy. So he's definitely not going away. He's not going to retire. He will probably be back, and I think that he's going to put a lot of pressure on this government, from the opposition. I don't see this as being, an entirely new era in Israeli politics. It's not like Bibi's going away. He's still there. He's just got a different job now. Now he's, the leader of the loyal opposition. So to me, again, as an outsider, it will be interesting to see if Bennett is at all more amenable to American interests than Netanyahu was, which again is not. It's a pretty low bar to be more flexible and more subservient to the U.S. than Netanyahu was. But still, will be interesting because I know there will be a lot of pressure on him not to bow to the Americans and kiss their ring. And I don't necessarily want to see Israel submit itself as a colony of the United States. That's not what I'm saying at all. I don't think that any country should, but I don't really want to see the United States doing a lot of stuff for Israel either. In fact, I'd be happy if everyone just minded their own business. As much as I don't like to see Israel doing nasty things to its own subjects, it really just adds insult to injury when Israel is influencing other countries, when they're bombing Syria or, putting a lot of pressure on the American government through their very extensive lobbying agency. Again, same thing goes for Saudi Arabia. They always are, the Gulf monarchies in Israel are sort of always jockeying for 1 and 2 as who the most pernicious foreign lobbyists are in the United States. Now, the other thing that I want to keep an eye on is if Bennett does make good in the next 2 years, because he's only going to be prime minister for 2 years, if he makes good on his promise to annex more of the West Bank, see where that goes, and if that in fact accelerates the Palestinian agitation for not a two-state solution but equal rights within Israel, which again, that if I had to think, playing not 4D chess, but I mean just trying to logically understand why would an Arab party back this guy. My only thought that comes to mind is they have to be, coming at this with an accelerationist mindset. That if we just make it absolutely clear to the rest of the world and to everyone and to the people in Israel, to the Palestinians, that no, the two-state solution is over forever, and we are clearly now in official terms, the West Bank is annexed, we're one country, then it becomes all of a sudden much more difficult for the Israelis to continue to deny the rights of Palestinians under the law. Because at that point, they'll be worse than apartheid. Because, in apartheid, the reason why only white people could vote in South Africa was because only white people were citizens of the quote-unquote Republic of South Africa. There were these other Bantustans, smaller republics, for each of the various ethnic groups in South Africa, other than the white race. And they were citizens of those countries, and they said, instead of having the two-state solution, the South Africans had like their 8-state solution or something like that. And they said, well, of course, everybody's citizens. They're not citizens of South Africa, so of course they don't get to vote here. Of course they don't have the right to own land here. They have the right to vote and to own land in their own country. Well, Israel's been trying to play this same game for a very long time with the Palestinians without ever giving them their own country, their own Bantustan. And if they just completely annex, the would-be Palestinian Bantustans in the West Bank, well, at that point, I don't see how this just continues forever. You don't just have, a two-tiered system where you have all these people who live in your country, under your flag, on your territory, who have been there forever, who you went in and said, hey, this land is ours now, and then you don't give them citizenship. And who knows, maybe Netanyahu isn't saying it out loud, but, if you notice, Netanyahu has really just kept the status quo. I don't think that he has. He might have this same idea in mind and think that he does not want to annex the West Bank, even though that is more popular amongst his voters and his voter base. Actually, going ahead with it again might destabilize the current situation, and so it's better just to preserve the status quo. Perhaps he is afraid that Bennett does mean to make good on this promise and could destabilize the current situation. But of course, he can't really say that since this is a very popular move in Israel. Although, if they did annex the West Bank and make all of its citizens, or all of its people citizens, I think that the Jews would still be a majority, though a much slimmer majority. It would be no longer, an entirely Jewish state. Right now, the Israelis are about 75%, but they would be in the 50s, like maybe 52%, 55%. Because I think there's close to 7 million Jews in Israel, about currently. And then within Israel proper, you've got about 2 million Arabs, and then another 3.3-ish in the West Bank. So you put those together, it's like 5.3 versus 7. Comes to like 57%, but I think it's not quite 7 million. So around 55%, let's say, would be Jewish at that point. And so then every Jewish party would have to cobble together a coalition in order to have the majority in the government, or else all it would take would be one Israeli Jewish party, probably, a decent-sized one, breaking off and joining all the Arab parties in order for there to be what is truly an Arab governing coalition in Israel. And so that's not something that the Israelis, could really allow. But that seems to be the direction that things are moving. That seems to be in the ways in which the winds of change are blowing. And I'm not a fan of the winds of change. I'm not at all a fan of Harold Macmillan. It is a overused analogy, but it does fit in this case. As the years go by, it's kind of interesting watching Israel and the U.S. They both seem to be careening towards disasters as far as the national government's concerned, and each government has had a lot of off-ramps over the years, and they never seem to take any of them, and so they just keep moving headlong towards the cliff. And at some point you think, well, gee, they've skipped all these exits so far. There's maybe 1 or 2 left. What are the odds they're going to take those exits? And it's arguable whether there even are any more exits off of this highway for Israel or the United States. The United States' problems, of course, are different. They're much more financial in nature. But as far as Israel goes, I mean, the existential crisis is coming at some point. And so if Netanyahu is right in any sense, and that he was sort of the dam keeping all of this at bay. Israel's reckoning with reality, with with facts on the ground, to borrow a phrase from the spooks. It may come sooner rather than later. So with that said, that pretty much sums up my initial thoughts of this new Israeli governing coalition. And I will keep an eye on this moving forward. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.